The air in the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal did not taste like air. It tasted like iron filings and ozone. It was a thick gray soup that coated the back of your throat and turned your spit into a dark metallic paste. I swallowed, trying to clear the grit, but the taste remained. It was the taste of the Empire in late 1944. I sat suspended 60 feet above the concrete floor, encased in the glass and steel cage of Crane Unit 4. My world was a grid of rusted girders and the dizzying drop to the dry dock below. The cabin was small, a sweating box of humidity that smelled of old grease, stale tobacco smoke from the operator before me, and the sharp electric scent of the massive motor humming directly behind my head. My name is Toru. I was 19 years old. I should have been in a uniform, holding a rifle in the jungle, screaming for the Emperor. Instead, I was here, holding two bakelite levers, my hands trembling, not from fear, not yet, but from a fatigue so deep it felt like it had dissolved my bones. Clang, clang, clang. The rhythm of the shipyard was a physical assault. Below me, 1,000 hammers beat against steel plates. The sound wasn't noise anymore. It was a texture. It vibrated through the floor of my cabin, traveled up the legs of the chair, and settled in the base of my spine. Even when I closed my eyes, I could feel the yard pulsing. It was the heartbeat of a dying giant. I wiped the condensation from the front glass with a rag that was black with oil. The view cleared, revealing the monster. We didn't call it a submarine, not the men on the crane crews. We called it the Kujira, the whale. It lay in the dry dock, a long black void in the center of the chaotic light. It was an I-400 class, a behemoth, larger than anything that should belong underwater. Its hull was a landscape of raw steel, covered in scaffolding that looked like wooden splinters against the dark metal. Sparks from arc welders showered down the sides like waterfalls of molten gold, sizzling as they hit the damp concrete floor far below. The beauty of it was terrifying. It was designed to kill, to slip under the waves and carry destruction to the other side of the world. But from up here, it looked helpless. An dissected animal, its ribs exposed, its internal organs being stitched together by swarms of men who looked no bigger than beetles. Nakamura, the radio crackled. The voice was distorted by static, tinny, and harsh. It was Foreman Sato. Load ready at Sector 7, the main intake assembly. Watch the sway. The wind is picking up coming off the bay. Acknowledged, I whispered. I didn't need to shout. The throat mic would pick up the vibration. My hands moved to the levers. They were slick with sweat. The rubber grips were worn smooth by the hands of men who were likely dead now, drafted and sent to the Philippines or Okinawa. I was deferred because I had the touch. That's what they called it. The ability to lower a 10-ton engine block onto a mounting bolt without scratching the paint. It was a curse. It kept me alive, but it kept me here, in this cage, watching the war being built piece by piece. I engaged the traverse motor. The entire gantry groaned. It was a low, mournful sound, the friction of steel wheels on steel rails. Grr, clack, grr, clack. I drifted to the left, the cabin swinging slightly. Below, the signalman was a blur of dirty white uniform. He waved his flags, red, green. I didn't look at the flags. I looked at his body language. He was tense. Everyone was tense. The Kempeitai, the military police, had been patrolling the catwalks all week. They wore plain clothes sometimes, but you could smell them. They watched us work. They watched for slowness. They watched for the lack of spirit. To drop a load, to damage a part, was not an accident. In 1944, an accident was sabotage. Sabotage was treason. I centered the hook over the crate in Sector 7. Down went the cable. The winch screamed, a high-pitched whine that drilled into my ears. I watched the heavy steel hook descend, twisting slowly in the air. Focus, I told myself. Be the machine. The ground crew scrambled over the crate, attaching the chains. It was the ballast valve assembly. Vital, the lungs of the whale. If these valves failed, the submarine couldn't dive, or worse, it couldn't surface. It would just be a steel tomb at the bottom of the Pacific. The signalman crossed his arms. The load was secured. I pulled back on the right lever. The slack tightened. The chains snapped taut, shaking off dust. The crate lifted. It was heavy. I could feel the weight pulling at the crane's center of gravity. The cabin tilted forward just a fraction of a degree. My stomach dropped with it. I held the breath in my lungs, counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3. I swung the load out over the open hull of the submarine. The gap in the deck was a dark mouth, waiting to swallow the machinery. "Easy, Nakamura, easy," the radio hissed. I feathered the controls. The crate hovered over the opening. I was looking down directly into the exposed section of the pressure hull. From this angle, 60 feet up, I had a view no one else had. The engineers were down in the pit. The foreman was on the deck. But I was God, looking down from the heavens. The arc lights from the shipyard roof cast long, harsh shadows. The light caught the metal of the valve seating area below, inside the hull. I squinted. The vibration of the crane traveled through my boots, shaking my knees. Something was wrong. I stopped the descent. The crate swayed gently, a pendulum of death suspended over the hull. "Lower it, Nakamura! We are on a schedule!" Sato barked in my ear. "Wait," I said to myself. I leaned forward, pressing my forehead against the cold, vibrating glass. The condensation wetted my skin. I focused on the mounting flange inside the submarine, the place where this massive valve system was supposed to bolt onto the pressure hull. The light flickered, then held steady for a moment. There was a shadow where there shouldn't be a shadow. A misalignment. The prefabricated curvature of the hull section didn't match the curvature of the valve frame I was holding. It was off by millimeters, maybe centimeters. But there was something else. A discoloration near the rivets of the hull plate. A spider web. My heart hammered against my ribs, louder than the pneumatic drills. It looked like a stress fracture, a hairline crack in the pressure hull, right where the intake stress would be highest. If I lowered this valve, the flange would cover it. It would be bolted down, sealed, painted over, hidden. But under the pressure of the deep ocean, under hundreds of meters of crushing black water, that hairline would snap. The ocean would force its way in like a high-pressure cutter. The men inside wouldn't even know they were dead until the water crushed them into paste. "Nakamura, what are you doing? Drop the load!" I looked at the signalman. He was waving frantically. I looked at the dark suit standing on the catwalks in the distance, the Kempeitai. If I stopped, I had to explain why. If I said the hull, the Emperor's steel, forged in the fires of Japanese spirit, was cracked, I was insulting the shipbuilders. I was delaying the war effort. I was questioning the perfection of the Imperial Navy. But if I lowered it, I was murdering the 70 men who would crew this vessel. My hand hovered over the lever. The sweat turned cold on my palms. The vibration of the crane felt like it was shaking me apart, dismantling my resolve. "Nakamura!" I swallowed the metallic taste of the air. It tasted like blood. "There is," I keyed the mic, my voice cracking, barely audible over the roar of the shipyard. "There is an obstruction." I lied. The silence in the crane cabin was heavier than the noise outside. I had released the dead man's switch, locking the massive gears in place. The heavy crate of valves hung suspended in the air, motionless, a dark square blocking out the shipyard lights. "I'm coming down," I said into the radio. My voice sounded foreign to me, hollow, like it belonged to a ghost. "Make it fast, Nakamura!" Sato's voice was a whip crack. I opened the cabin door. The wind hit me instantly. It was a cold, wet slap from Tokyo Bay, carrying the stink of salt and dead fish. It cut through my thin cotton overalls, raising goose flesh on my arms. I wiped my hands on my thighs, trying to dry the sweat, but the oil and the fear made a paste that wouldn't leave. I stepped out onto the gantry walkway. The metal grating was slippery. 60 feet down through the mesh, I could see the tops of the workers' heads. They had stopped moving. They were all looking up. 100 faces, pale dots in the gloom, staring at the boy who had stopped the war. I grabbed the ladder rails. The steel was freezing. It burned my palms. Step, clank, step, clank. The descent was a blur of vertigo. With every rung, the air grew thicker, heavier. Up in the crane, the air was thin and metallic. Down here, in the pit of the dry dock, it was a swamp. The smell of welding flux was overpowering, a sweet, acrid chemical scent that stung the eyes. Mixed with it was the smell of the harbor mud, exposed and rotting at the bottom of the drained dock. I reached the concrete floor. My legs felt like jelly. The vibration of the ground was different here. It wasn't a hum, It was a thudding, felt through the soles of my boots. "Where is it? Where's the obstruction?" A man in a greasy cap grabbed my shoulder. It was the signalman. His eyes were wide, rimmed with red dust. He looked terrified. If I delayed the schedule, he would be blamed too. "Inside," I mumbled, pulling away. On the mounting flange, I saw debris. I walked toward the Kujira. From the ground, the submarine was impossible to comprehend. It was a wall of black steel that blocked out the sky. It curved upward, slick with moisture, towering like a cliff face. The rivets were the size of apples. The welding seams were scars that ran for miles. I felt small, insignificant. A gnat walking up to a sleeping dragon. I climbed the wooden scaffolding that hugged the hull. The wood groaned under my weight. It was slick with rain and oil. I reached the opening, the jagged hole in the pressure hull where the valve assembly was meant to go. It was dark inside. "Light," I demanded. Someone handed me a heavy flashlight. The brass casing was dented. I clicked it on. A yellow beam cut through the gloom. I stepped inside the submarine. The sound changed instantly. Outside, the shipyard roared. Inside, the noise was muffled, distant, like listening to the world from underwater. But there was a new sound, the echo of my own breathing. Ha 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 ha. It bounced off the curved steel walls, amplifying my fear. The air inside was stagnant. It smelled of raw steel, primer paint, and the sweat of the men who had been working in here for 12-hour shifts. It was the smell of confinement. I crawled across the temporary wooden flooring laid over the keel. I made my way to the intake section. "Well?" Sato's voice boomed from the opening behind me. He hadn't climbed in yet, but his presence filled the space. I ignored him. I fell to my knees. The steel was cold against my kneecaps. I directed the beam of light onto the hull plate, right where the flange would bolt down. My hand trembled as I reached out. There it was. From the crane, it had looked like a shadow. From here, inches away, it was a nightmare. It wasn't a scratch. It was a stress fracture, running from the edge of the rivet line and disappearing into the darkness of the hull curve. It was thin, barely the width of a human hair, but to a trained eye, it screamed. The metal had been cooled too fast, or the plate had been dropped, or the steel mixture was poor, too much scrap, not enough iron, a symptom of an empire running out of resources. I ran my thumb over it. It snagged. The tactility of it sent a shock up my arm. The steel was raised slightly on one side of the crack. It was rough, sharp, jagged. I pressed my fingernail into it. It caught. This wasn't surface damage. This went deep. I closed my eyes for a microsecond, imagining the physics. When this submarine dove to 100 meters, the ocean would press against this hull with the weight of a freight train. The steel needed to flex. It needed to be perfect. This crack would not flex. It would unzip. I could hear the sound in my mind, not the roar of the ocean, but the sharp pistol crack of steel snapping, followed instantly by the roar of water. The implosion. The 70 men inside wouldn't drown. They would be incinerated by the pressure change before the water even touched them. "Nakamura!" I flinched. Foreman Sato was climbing through the hatch. He was a bear of a man, his uniform stained dark with sweat, his face purple with exertion. He carried a wrench in his hand like a weapon. "You stopped my crane. You stopped my line." He was breathing hard, the smell of stale rice wine and cheap tobacco wafting off him. Show me this obstruction." I stayed on my knees. I pointed the flashlight at the hairline fracture. "There," I whispered. "Look." Sato stomped over. The wooden boards rattled. He squatted down, his knees popping. He squinted. He didn't look at the metal. He looked at me first, his eyes narrowing, searching for deception. Then he looked down. He wiped the steel with his gloved thumb. He spat on it, rubbing the saliva into the crack, then wiped it again. The silence stretched. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. I could hear the drip, drip, drip of condensation falling from the ceiling of the hull. It sounded like a clock ticking down. Sato stared at the crack. I saw his jaw muscle tighten. I saw the recognition in his eyes. He saw it. He knew what it was. He was a foreman. He knew steel better than he knew his own children. He knew that this plate was compromised. He knew it needed to be cut out and replaced, a job that would take 3 weeks. 3 weeks the Empire did not have. He slowly stood up. He towered over me. The shadows from his flashlight distorted his face, making his eyes look like hollow sockets. "I see nothing," he said. The words hung in the damp air between us, heavy and toxic. I see nothing. My heart skipped a beat, then slammed against my ribs. "Foreman," I stammered, my voice barely a squeak. It's right there. The stress fracture. Feel it. It catches the nail." Sato didn't look at the crack. He looked at the wrench in his hand. He turned it over, feeling its weight. The metal was dull and scarred. "I see a scratch, Nakamura," he said softly. His voice wasn't angry anymore. It was flat, dead. It was the voice of a man who had already decided to bury his soul. "A scratch from a tool, nothing more." "It's not a scratch," I insisted, the desperation rising in my throat like bile. "It follows the grain structure. If we bolt the valve over this, the pressure differential will—" "Shut up!" The shout echoed inside the steel tube, ringing in my ears. Sato took a step closer. He grabbed the front of my overalls with his free hand and hauled me up. I was light. Rations had been cut 3 times this year. I weighed nothing. He pulled me close. I could see the pores in his nose, the red veins in his eyes. I could smell the fear coming off him. It was a sour, milky smell. He wasn't afraid of the crack. He was afraid of the schedule. He was afraid of the phone call he would have to make to the admiral. "Do you know what happens if we report a hull defect now?" he hissed, his spit hitting my face. "Do you? The Kempeitai come. They ask who inspected this plate. They ask who welded it. They ask why the crane operator is looking at hull plates instead of lifting crates." He shook me. "They will find sabotage, Nakamura. If they look for it, they will find it. They will take the welder, old Tanaka, and they will beat him until he admits he did it on purpose. They will take me, and they will take you." My knees shook. The image of the Kempeitai interrogation rooms flashed in my mind. The stories whispered in the mess hall. Bamboo under the fingernails, water hoses. "But the crew," I whispered. "The men. The men are soldiers." Sato released me, shoving me back. I stumbled, hitting my shoulder against the curved wall. The cold steel bit into me. "They are prepared to die. We are all prepared to die." He shone his light onto the crack again, then kicked a pile of metal shavings over it. "Clean the surface," he commanded. "Apply the sealant. Bolt the valve." "I can't," I said, tears pricking my eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of frustration. "I can't be the one to—" "You are the one who stopped the work," Sato roared. He pointed the wrench at my chest. "You went down. You inspected. You found debris. You cleared it. That is the report." He leaned in close again. "If you say another word, Nakamura, I will tell them you dropped a wrench on the hull. I will tell them you created the crack to delay the launch because you are a coward and a traitor." The threat hit me with physical force. Traitor. In 1944, that word was a death sentence, not just for me, but for my mother, for my sister. The shame would destroy them before the starvation did. Sato turned his back on me. He walked to the hatch, his boots heavy on the wood. "Get back in the crane," he said, his voice echoing. "You have 2 minutes. If that crate isn't moving in 2 minutes, I call the guards." He climbed out. I was alone in the belly of the whale. The silence returned, rushing in to fill the space Sato had left. I looked down at the floor. I kicked the shavings away. The crack was still there, a thin, jagged line, a smile. Death smiling at me. My hands were trembling so hard I could barely control them. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a rag. I had a choice. I could run out, I could scream, I could find an officer. But Sato was right. The officer would see a delay. The officer would see a boy who didn't want to work, and the submarine would launch anyway. I sank to the floor. The metal was freezing, sucking the heat out of my body. I felt a profound exhaustion, a black weight pressing down on my shoulders. This was the war. It wasn't flags and bugles. It was this, a dark room, a lie, and the terrible crushing momentum of a machine that could not be stopped. I reached out and touched the crack one last time. It felt like a wound. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the empty air. "I'm sorry." I stood up. My legs felt like they didn't belong to me. I walked to the hatch, my boots scraping on the wood. I climbed the ladder, emerging back into the blinding lights and the roar of the shipyard. The wind hit me again, drying the sweat on my face. It felt like ice. I climbed the 60 feet back to my cage. Every step was a labor, clang, clang, clang. I sat in the operator's chair. It was still warm. I grabbed the levers. The bakelite was slippery. "Sector 7, I said into the mic. My voice was dead. Obstruction cleared. Resuming load. Copy, Sato's voice came back. He sounded relieved. I pulled the lever. The winch whined. The crate of valves descended. I watched through the glass as the heavy machinery lowered into the hole. It went down, down, down. It hovered for a moment, then settled. Thud. It covered the crack. The men swarmed over it with impact wrenches. Rat-a-tat-tat-tat. The sound was like machine gun fire. They were bolting it down, sealing the secret. I closed my eyes. I could feel the vibration of the wrenches all the way up in the crane. They were tightening the bolts on a coffin. Shift change came at 0400 hours. The darkness was absolute, save for the searchlights sweeping the harbor. I didn't go to the barracks. I couldn't face the smell of the other men, the smell of sleep and unwashed bodies. I couldn't listen to their snoring, knowing that some of them might be assigned to the Kujira. Instead, I walked to the edge of the pier. The water of the bay was black oil, lapping against the concrete pilings. Slap, slap, slap. My hands were still shaking. I looked at them. They were stained with grease and rust. I scrubbed them against my pants, but the stain went deeper than the skin. I lit a cigarette. It was a cheap ration thing, mostly sawdust and harsh tobacco. The smoke burned my lungs, grounding me. Nakamura-san? I jumped. It was Kenji. He was younger than me, maybe 17. He was a rivet heater's assistant. His face was smudged with soot, making his eyes look impossibly white. "You look sick," he said. He offered me a canteen. "Water?" I shook my head. "I'm fine." Kenji looked out at the dry dock. The Kujira loomed in the distance, a mountain of shadow. "She is beautiful, isn't she?" Kenji whispered. There was awe in his voice. "They say she can carry 3 seaplanes. They say she will sail to America and burn their cities." He looked at me, his eyes shining with a fanatic's hope. "We are going to win, aren't we, Toru? With weapons like this?" I looked at the boy. I looked at the submarine. I thought of the crack, hidden now under inches of steel and rubber gaskets. I thought of the pressure of the deep. I took a long drag of the cigarette. The cherry glowed red in the dark. "Yes," I lied. "We are going to win." The lie tasted like ash. I turned back to the ship. They were painting the hull now. I could smell the fumes from here, chemical and sharp. They were painting over the welds, painting over the bolts. I realized then that the whole war was like that crack. It was broken, structurally unsound, but we just kept painting over it. We just kept bolting heavy things onto a fractured frame, hoping it would hold for one more day, one more battle. But physics doesn't care about hope. Physics doesn't care about the Emperor. I threw the cigarette into the water. It hissed and vanished. "Come on, Kenji," I said. "Let's get some sleep." As we walked away, I felt a phantom vibration in the soles of my feet, a cracking sound. I knew I would hear it for the rest of my life. Time in the shipyard was measured in rivets driven and inches welded. But after that night in the hull, time accelerated. It blurred. 3 weeks later, the Kujira was ready. The launch ceremony was a somber affair. By late 1944, there were no brass bands. There were no cheering crowds waving rising sun flags. The air raids had burned away the enthusiasm of the civilian population. There was only the gray sky, the gray water, and the gray faces of the naval officers. I sat in my crane, Unit 4, watching from above. I was the silent observer, the accomplice. The dry dock pumps were reversed. The sea rushed back in, gurgle, hiss, roar. I watched the dirty water rise around the keel of the submarine. It swirled around the rudder, climbing the steel flanks like a rising tide of guilt. It covered the wooden blocks. It crept up the hull plates. And then, the moment of truth. The water reached the intake valves. I gripped the control levers of the crane so hard my knuckles turned white. I stopped breathing. I waited for the bubbles. I waited to see a stream of air escaping from that hairline crack, betraying the flaw before the ship even left the dock. Please, I prayed to a God I no longer believed in. Please let it leak now. Let them see it. Let them stop it. But the water rose, dark and smooth. No bubbles, no hiss. The heavy layer of sealant and the brute force of the bolts were holding. The flaw was hidden. The coffin was watertight. The submarine floated. It lifted off the blocks with a groan of shifting metal that vibrated through the ground and up into my tower. It was free. On the deck, the crew stood in formation, 70 men, They looked so small from 60 feet up, just lines of white and navy blue. I tried to pick out faces, but they were just pixels in a grainy photograph. They were saluting the direction of the Imperial Palace. I wasn't saluting, I was counting them. 1, 2, 3, 70 ghosts. The tugboats moved in, their engines chugging, smoke belching into the overcast sky. They nudged the behemoth toward the open sea. The Kujira began to move. It didn't look majestic to me. It looked like a beast limping away to die. The black paint absorbed the light, making it look like a hole in the world. As it passed my sector, the vibration of its massive diesel engines rattled the glass of my cabin. Thrum, thrum, thrum. It felt like the heartbeat of the ship, a heartbeat with a murmur. I watched until it was just a speck in the Tokyo Bay, merging with the leaden horizon. "Good luck," whispered the radio operator in my ear. I took off my headset and let it drop to the floor. The silence returned, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the knowledge of what I had done. I had let the monster go. Chapter 6. The Report. Epilogue. Yokosuka, 1947. The war ended not with a bang, but with a flash of light we couldn't see from here, and then a voice on the radio, the Emperor's voice. And then, the silence. The Americans came in their jeeps and their big ships. They took over the shipyard. They didn't build, they dismantled. I was still there. I wasn't a crane operator anymore. I was a laborer, clearing debris, scrapping the half-finished dreams of the empire. We cut up the hulls of ships that never sailed. We turned swords into spoons, quite literally. The hunger was different now. It wasn't the patriotic hunger of wartime. It was the hollow, confused hunger of defeat. I worked in the administrative building, hauling boxes of documents to the incinerators. The Americans were cataloging everything before burning it. They wanted to know how we built things. They wanted to know our secrets. One rainy afternoon, I was moving a stack of files from the Naval Design Bureau. A folder slipped from the top of the pile and spilled onto the wet asphalt. Papers scattered in the mud. I knelt to pick them up, wiping the rain from the pages. The ink was blurring. My heart stopped. I recognized the silhouette on the blueprint, the elongated hull, the massive hangar on the deck. It was the Kujira, the I-400 class. I frantically gathered the papers, shoving them under my jacket. I looked around. The MP at the gate was smoking, looking the other way. I ran to the workers' shed, my breath coming in short, painful gasps. I sat in the corner, under the leaking roof, and opened the file. It wasn't just blueprints, it was an operational report. A post-mortem analysis conducted by the American technical team who had interviewed captured naval officers. My hands shook so hard, I nearly tore the paper. I scanned the English text. I had learned enough from the occupation forces to read the basics. Subject: loss of I-402, provisional ID. Date: April 1945. Location: southwest of Okinawa. My eyes raced down the page, looking for the cause. Was it a depth charge, a torpedo, a mine? And then I saw it. Survivors report no enemy contact. During emergency dive maneuvers to evade patrol aircraft, the vessel suffered a catastrophic structural failure at a depth of 85 meters. I stopped breathing. The sound of the rain on the tin roof faded away. I was back in the hull. I was back on my knees, feeling the jagged catch of the steel. Acoustic analysis suggests rupture of the pressure hull near the forward ballast intake assembly. The influx of water was instantaneous. The vessel was lost with all hands. All hands. I lowered the paper. It hadn't been a battle. It hadn't been a glorious sacrifice. The ocean had simply found the crack. The physics had done exactly what physics does. The stress accumulated. The hairline fracture, hidden under the valve flange, had opened up like a zipper. The Pacific Ocean, with the weight of miles of water behind it, had punched through the steel. I imagined the sound, the shriek of tearing metal, the roar, the darkness. I imagined Sato. Did he know? In those last few seconds when the hull screamed, did he remember the boy in the crane? Did he remember the debris he had wiped away? I sat in the shed for a long time. The paper grew sodden in my hands, dissolving into pulp. I had survived the war. I had food in my belly today. I had a job. But I realized then that I had died in 1944. I had died the moment I pulled that lever and lowered the crate. The boy who climbed down the ladder was gone. The man who sat here now was just a ghost, haunting a world that had moved on. I stood up. I walked to the incinerator where the other workers were burning the files. The fire was hot, roaring against the damp air. I threw the report into the flames. I watched the paper curl, turn black, and disappear. The smoke rose up, joining the gray clouds over Yokosuka. I looked at my hands. They looked clean, but I could still feel the vibration, the clang, clang, clang of the shipyard, the heartbeat of the machine, and beneath it all, the faint, terrible sound of steel cracking in the deep.